Um, Oops,
Yep, that's me.
just got told I'm being recorded. Um, but I can't resist. She's very persuasive. So she's hooked me for 2 more lectures, even though I'm retired. So thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction and for the invitation. I also want to say that I'm not really the world's expert on Tiffany or anything, and I owe an awful lot of people thanks for getting me in the position to be able to do these tours and lectures about Troy's Tiffany Windows. I want to thank Sandy Charette, Sloan Bullough, Tom Phelan, Denise Scammell, Bill Cummings, Diane Rousseau, and there are a host of others who shall remain nameless, and probably most important, Ned Pratt, who really is the greatest expert on Troy's Tiffany Windows and the Tiffany's around here, along with his buddies Alice Cooney Frelinghuysen and Julie Sloan, all of whom have taught me everything I know about Tiffany. I also want to say before I get started that no photograph can possibly do justice to a Tiffany window. So if you really want to see Troy's Tiffany treasures, you simply have to come to Troy and go to these locations and stand in front of the window on a day when it's properly lit and run your hand over the drapery glass on the window itself. It's the only way to experience it, but this is the best I can do via Zoom. Now, some reason it's not working. There we go. Bill Cummings, back before he retired, and he's now passed away, was arguably the top Tiffany window restorer in the world. And he came to Troy many years ago, and I followed him around as we went to all the places in Troy. And he said, Troy happens to be the mother lode of Tiffany windows in the world and has more Tiffany windows per square mile than any other city on the whole planet. Now, I don't know whether that's entirely true. There are an awful lot of Tiffany windows in New York City. There are plenty in Rochester, New York, and a few other places as well. But Troy certainly has a share of them. This one is at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church, where there are over 40 Tiffany windows. This one is at St. John's Episcopal Church, and this particular 5-lancet window is world famous, as you're going to find out during the lecture. This is at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which is on one of only 4 buildings in the world to have a whole interior by Tiffany. And this one is the famous Aldus Window at the Troy Public Library, for whom I'm giving this lecture. So we're going to single that particular window out for special treatment at the end of the lecture. Now, why, you might say, does little old Troy, New York, with its population of 50,000, end up being the place with the mother lode of Tiffany windows? Well, there's 3 primary reasons for that. One was that Troy and the area around it was what I call the Silicon Valley of the 19th century. In the same way that the Santa Clara Valley of California started out when I was a little boy as apricot orchards, and of course then turned into what we all know as Silicon Valley. This area just blossomed in the decades leading up to the American Civil War, and people deliberately promoted it to be the place where you could do the most innovative new technological things. And it was just the right spot to do it because it had really good transportation, both down to New York City and out to the Atlantic Ocean, and also across, first of all, the Mohawk River Valley and then the Erie Canal to get to the Midwest. And it also had wonderful waterfalls on either side of the Hudson River, and the water coming over those bluffs provided power for factories. There's also really good resources here, et cetera. So the place just took off. And as a result, Troy wasn't all that big a city by the time of the 1840 census, but per person, it was the 4th wealthiest city in the United States. So there were a lot of wealthy people here, but almost everybody here was pretty rich. And then after the Civil War, Troy started to fade a little bit, as did lots of the other sort of early 19th century cities, and the metropolises started to bloom. New York City was the first city in North America to have a population over 1 million people, which it did by the 1880 census. And lots of people started migrating to cities like New York. The people who stayed in Troy wanted to prove to their old friends and relatives and neighbors who had moved to New York City that Troy was every bit as classy as New York City was. So they brought Tiffany and lots of others up here to make the magnificent architecture of Troy to prove that we were still a really classy place, even if our light was fading compared to New York City by the late 1800s. We're talking about this fellow right here, Louis Comfort Tiffany. Louis Comfort Tiffany literally was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His father was Charles Tiffany. Started out very modestly with a little gift shop, essentially, but of course became the jeweler, Charles Tiffany, on Fifth Avenue, as in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, etc. And so he grew up wealthy and privileged, and you can see him here at age 23, around 1908 and 1925, not long before he died. Quite the distinguished gentleman. He did not start out to be a jeweler. He did not start out to be a window designer or to work with glass at all. He started out to be a painter. He studied with a fellow who you see right here, George Inness, who was one of the leading painters in North America at the time. And then, as all wealthy young men who wanted to be fully rounded out in their education did at the time, he went on a grand tour of Europe and the Mediterranean and north of Africa, studying all the art and the antiquities and the history and so on. And he did practice his painting while he was there. One of his paintings you see here from 1873, Market Day outside the walls of Tangiers, Morocco. He wasn't too bad, and he probably could have made a modest living as a painter if he wanted to. But somewhere right around the time he did this painting, around 1872, he started fiddling around with glass, and he started thinking that he might want to make windows. Apparently the first window he made was in 1876. What we think might have happened was that he saw all the great stained glass windows in the cathedrals of Europe from the medieval period and thought they were magnificent, but that he could do a better job. This was sort of the art of stained glass window making about the time he got started, and it's very nice. If you look here at this 16th century Polish window, it's very ornate, so on. But if you look closely at it, it's actually a bunch of stencils here and things painted onto the glass. So it's actually colored glass with paintings on it. And while we're at the point of talking about colored glass, actually all these supposedly stained glass windows, they're not stained glass. Technically, if you want to be really precise about it, stained glass means you take glass and you paint some stuff on the outside of it, usually some kind of a thing that would glaze to an orangey color, and then you would heat it up and it would fuse to the glass. That's stained glass. There's examples of that, almost 4,000 years old, from Syria and that area. You could find them at the Corning Museum of Glass, Corning, New York, if you want. These are all actually colored glass windows. The color is in the glass, it's not stained on, although they did do a little staining too, but everybody calls them stained glass windows anyway. And these were nice, of course, but compared to them, this window was a little nicer. This is a rather classic Tiffany stained glass window. And you notice, unlike those other windows that have lots of people in them, this one has no people in it. It's all nature. It's a landscape window. And we'll talk a little bit about the transition from windows with people in them and landscape windows and how important it was for Tiffany to do that for his artwork and how big a shift that was as we go on and look at all the windows around Troy. One of the earliest known Tiffany windows is this one. It still exists. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Tiffany made this one somewhere in the late 1870s or so, and he put it in his own apartment in New York. And as you can see, it's a pretty abstract design. He was just noodling around with colored glass, how to put it together and how it would work. He didn't quite have himself focused yet on what exactly he wanted to do with this, but it was clear that this was so appealing to him as a concept that he forgot about painting and so on and started doing this. And he formed the Tiffany Glass Company in 1879, just a few years after that painting, while he was fiddling around with glass like this. He was 31 years old when he formed the Tiffany Glass Company. He clearly couldn't have done it if it wasn't for the fact that he was the son of a very rich man who could help bankroll him as he set up all the materials and things that he wanted, that he needed for a proper operation to make stained glass windows. Now, Tiffany's probably better known to most people, not for his windows, but for the famous Tiffany lamps. Actually, the Tiffany lamps were a byproduct of the windows. It was windows that were the things that really mattered to him the most. Those were the things they focused on the most. But the lamps came about because of this very creative woman here, Clara Driscoll, who was a member of his team and supervised all the lamp making, among other things. They were all sitting around saying, what are we going to do with all these little scraps of glass that we have left over when we cut up the big sheets of glass to make our stained glass windows? And she said, I know what we can do with the smaller pieces. And she literally took a wooden salad bowl, turned it upside down, and soldered the pieces onto it as a big dome and said, we can use these as lampshades in these newfangled Edison electric lamps that people are putting into their parlors. And that's where the famous Tiffany lamps came from. But it was the windows that were his primary focus. And the reason why he could do better than all those windows he saw in the medieval cathedrals and done by all the other classic stained glass window makers is because he started experimenting with new techniques for making the stained glass windows. For one thing, he didn't just join the pieces of glass the same way everybody else used to do. They used to join them with what you see here, little lead, sort of little lead I-beams called cames, C-A-M-E-S, M as in Michael. And you could have all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and you could put the pieces of glass in and then pinch them, and that holds the glass together. And that worked. People still use them today. And Tiffany wasn't above using those. He did use them some or a lot here and there. But what he also started doing was soldering the pieces of glass together. You would take the two pieces of glass and you would put a little strip of copper foil on the edge of each one, sort of like Scotch tape made out of copper, or, you know, instead of aluminum foil in your kitchen, copper foil. You'd wrap it a little bit around the front of the back, you put it together, and then you would take a soldering iron and you would solder the pieces together. That would allow you to modify the thickness and the color of the joint much more readily than you could do with the cames. And that way you could make the joint itself part of the artwork. If you were doing a flower and you had all those little delicate petals, you'd make the solder joints nice and tiny and black, like the edges of leaves. If you were doing a wall, you'd make the joint nice and thick and black, and that would be a mortar joint in the wall, etc. That was technique number one that made Tiffany Windows different from everybody else's. Second, Tiffany used more than one layer of glass for his windows. They called it plating. And you can see here that this window has an extra plate here sticking out above this plate. Actually, there's two plates. There's one here, and then there's this one on top of another one. So there's three plates there. Tiffany windows sometimes had as many as 7 different plates on them. If you look on the back of a Tiffany window, it's all lumpy and bumpy and irregular. It doesn't look like much of anything. And all of that is so you can create all kinds of lighting and coloring effects and almost 3-dimensional effects in the windows that you couldn't do with flat pieces of glass like you saw in the medieval cathedrals. And the third and most important thing that Tiffany did was that he decided that as much as possible, he wasn't going to use any stencils and he wasn't going to use any paint. He was going to actually create the artwork with the glass itself. No more taking a flat piece of red glass and painting all the folds of a robe on it and calling that somebody's robe. If you wanted to make a robe out of red for somebody, you would take a red piece of glass, and while it was still hot and soft, you would fold the folds of the robe right into the glass, just like this. Similarly, if you wanted to have things that looked like jewelry, you would use what were called cabochon or jewel glass. You would make a round piece of glass, either smooth or lumpy like a rock, and it would act like a lens and bring more light in from that spot, make it look brighter than the rest of the window, even if it wasn't very bright outside. You could put all kinds of other features in. They had feathered glass, which they used for angel wings, as you'll see later. This is called streamer glass or model glass. This is called confetti glass. I'm going to show you a real good example of confetti glass later on at one of the churches when we go on. And the last thing was, besides all these different kinds of glass, the basic kind of glass that they use is called opalescent glass. And it's sort of translucent glass with lots of colors in it that they could create and modify in lots of different ways. Here's how they made it. Oh, there's the draper glass, just so you can get a close-up look. And you see how the glass here is sort of milky with all those colors in it? That's called opalescent glass. And this is going to show you how it's made. You ready?
Glassmaking dates back more than 40 centuries. In the late 1800s, glassmakers created something spectacular, glass that was both milky and translucent. They called it opalescent glass. Like its namesake, the opal gemstone, its beauty lies in the way it magically catches the light. Opalescent glass is a semi-transparent glass accented with a solid color or a swirling mix of colors. Glassmakers create it by melting minerals such as silica sand, soda ash, dolomite, limestone, and fluorspar. Adding recycled glass helps speed up the melting process and stretches costly raw materials further. They color the mix with pigments, in this case cobalt oxide, which gives a distinctive blue tint. A hoist then lifts the raw ingredients, called batch, up to the mixer, which has 2 chambers. Ingredients flow from end to end between them, thoroughly blending the batch. The blended batch now goes via wagon to the beehive, a furnace that contains 12 ceramic pots. The furnace man shovels the batch into a pot to melt at a searing 1426 degrees Celsius. He pushes any spills back into the pot. Then, to control the temperature inside, closes up the pot's mouth. "24 hours later, workers gather the glowing molten glass. With only seconds to spare, they hurry to the mixing table, keeping the glass in motion to prevent it from cooling unevenly on the way. It's critical they cool off the ladles between each use, or the next gather of glass will stick to the ladle surface. The ladles they use vary in size, holding between 2 and 18 kilograms of molten glass. Workers pour as many as 5 different ladles at once to make a single color. The mixing table is where the magic happens. The table man picks up one gather of burning molten glass, then another, then skillfully blends them together using a steel fork. He then flips the molten glass into a rolling machine, evening it out as it squeezes through the rollers. Out comes a sheet about 2 meters long and 3 millimeters thick. Every 90 seconds, workers fill their ladles with 1200 degrees Celsius molten glass. Mixing the molten glass on the table helps cool it and blend the colors. This temporarily alters its appearance, but not its final color. The table man separates the glass sheet from the table surface, forcing out any trapped air bubbles and further cooling the glass. The sheet now goes into a leer, an oven that anneals the glass, cooling it evenly to prevent it from cracking. From there, it's on to the trimming table. Workers wear protective clothing to handle the razor-sharp edges, still hot to the touch. Cutting the glass sheets is a delicate 2-man job. They must work in sync to keep pace with the sheets that keep on coming. A single pot produces about 25 sheets over 24 hours. That's 300 sheets a day from just one 12-pot furnace. Using a carbide-tipped cutter, the workers score the glass, then snap apart the pieces. Standard 81 centimeter square sheets. They set aside the excess glass to remelt it in a new batch. Finally, they load the sheets into crates and ship them all over the world. Just look how artists use opalescent glass to create a feast of pattern, color, and light. Like a painting, only more fragile.
I have to tell you an anecdote about this. I've given the Tiffany tour a bazillion times in Troy, and I've been giving it for years to cruise boats who come from out of town through downtown Troy. And I had a whole bunch of cruise boat passengers, and we were in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and I showed them that little video while they were all sitting in the pews on my iPad. And when I finished and everybody started wandering around looking at everything, one guy came up to me and he said, "I just retired after spending 25 years as a driver for UPS. And guess where I lived? Kokomo, Indiana. I used to pick up all the shipments of opalescent glass from the Kokomo Opalescent Glass Company." So small world. There's a bit of a controversy about who actually was involved in developing opalescent glass sheets. And actually, Tiffany himself and his major competitor, John Lafarge, weren't the only two. There were a lot of people who were getting into this racket at about that time and trying to figure out what to do with it. But both Tiffany and one of his mentors, John Lafarge, patented something that had to do with, as you can see here in the patent specification, colored glass windows. Within a year of each other, after they started feuding about who was the real stained glass window guy, Lafarge's patent spec is 2 pages long and Tiffany's is 1 page long. And mostly it talks about using plating and other effects and not really the opalescent glass itself. But the two of them feuded and threatened for a while to sue each other over who really was the new glass window person, but they finally just decided to go on with their work. Tiffany really eclipsed Lafarge, not because Lafarge wasn't very good. Here's one of his windows at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He obviously knew how to do this kind of window too. And it's a landscape window. It doesn't have any people in it either. But Tiffany, of course, was the son of Charles Tiffany, and he could do it a lot more energetically than Lafarge could. Lafarge was in Newport, Rhode Island. He had some backers and everything, but not like Tiffany. Tiffany in 1879 starts the Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company at the Lower West Side of Manhattan, 4th Avenue, 25th Street. And this was his factory where they made everything. It was a pretty huge operation, and it wasn't just him and a couple of friends. There were whole crews of people. This was the design room at that location. The whole room full of people and tables where they did the designs for all the different windows that people wanted. So it wasn't just Tiffany sitting there doodling the way Lafarge and his handful of people were doing. This was really sort of an industrialized operation for making the windows. Once they had the design, here was another whole crew of people who went around and used the designs to cut all the pieces of glass and start putting them together in the windows. So it was really a huge operation. In addition to that, Tiffany realized early on that if he was going to use just glass and nothing else to do his artwork in the windows, and he wanted to do increasingly complex windows, then he had to be really innovative with coming up with all kinds of new glass. So what does he do? He acquires property in Corona, Queens. This is what it looks like today. And they called that the Tiffany Furnace. And he recruited a fellow from Sturbridge, England, which is the glass capital of England, who really knew his stuff and was a chemist as well as a glass person named Arthur Nash. And Arthur Nash and his son worked here for decades developing all manner of unusual bits of glass, which is why Tiffany could do just the right piece of glass all the time. In addition to that, he had a huge inventory of glass. So when you wanted to do somebody's robe just right, you could go through that whole inventory until you found just the right piece of glass for your window. That's part of the reason why he was so successful. That's why they sold so many Tiffany windows that they needed a whole showroom by the late 1800s, which they opened on Madison Avenue at 45th Street in Manhattan. Here's what it looked like. So that was the Tiffany operation, and that was how they did their windows, and that's why it was world famous, and that's why all the rich people in Troy wanted Tiffany to put windows into their buildings, because they wanted to show that Troy was the classiest place in the country and could buy the finest stained glass windows in the world. And that's exactly what they did. We're now going to go around town and look at just a little bit of Tiffany's stuff all over town. I call the lecture Tiffany's Treasures instead of Tiffany Windows, because Tiffany did a lot more than just windows in Troy. And the best example of that is St. Paul's Episcopal Church at 3rd and State, which you see here. As I said briefly before, it's one of only 4 buildings in the whole world that has a whole interior done by Tiffany Studios. There were 5, but one of them unfortunately was demolished. This church was actually built in the 1820s, designed by a man named Ithiel Town, but they had to revamp it in the 1890s because the ceiling, the roof was starting to sag and push the walls out, because these columns didn't exist then and they needed to put those in. So rather than just putting in big steel columns and making it ugly, they brought Tiffany in, and Tiffany redid the whole interior. All of this truss work is Tiffany truss work. There's gilded and aluminum paint all over that and up on the ceiling. That's all Tiffany. All of these chandeliers, there's 4 different kinds. They called them electroliers, were all designed by Tiffany. The pews are Tiffany. Let's go on. The altar rail is Tiffany. The gold mosaics around the altar are Tiffany. All this woodwork here is Tiffany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on and on. Oh, and this canopy over the pulpit is a Tiffany design as well. It was supposed to project the speaker's voice out into the congregation, but it was much more successful at capturing all the whispers of the congregation and putting them into the ear of the celebrant. It sort of worked backwards from what it was supposed to do. But it's still there and you can still go see it. This is a Tiffany window here. That's a Tiffany window. There are 8 major Tiffany windows in that one church. And that one right there is one that just happens to be signed by the man who was the project director for the whole St. Paul's Episcopal Church project, and was also involved in lots of other things in Troy as well. It's J.A. Holzer, one of his top designers, his expert on mosaics and his expert on murals. He painted the mural for the baptismal font at both St. Paul's and at St. John's, for example. He was the project director for St. Paul's, and he signed that big window behind the altar because he designed it, and he didn't finish it until he had left Tiffany, and Tiffany let him take the project over. There's also a Holzer window in the back of the church, which is Christ saving a man from drowning, which is also quite an original window. Holzer designed and signed that one as well. Here's a detail of his window over the altar. It gives you some idea of how richly they could color all of the garments with that drapery glass. None of this is paint. All of this is just the glass itself. His buddy Frederick Wilson was the angel wing guy, and he learned how to produce all these angel wings. Every single feather is a separate piece of glass, and they all have patterns, ribs on the outside edges of them, so they look like feathers. The one thing they could not do with the glass itself, ever, were the faces and the hands and the feet. All of those human features, they tried it with cutting glass. It made it look like a cyborg from a science fiction movie. Never worked. So they always had to go back and paint the faces on, the eyes and the hands and the noses. And Tiffany hated that. It was sort of like pasting a happy face on a work of art. So he always tried to get the human figures out of his windows and put in just nature scenes. And of course, all the congregations always wanted to have ecclesiastical windows that depicted a scene from the Bible that had people in it. So that was always a contest. Second place we'll go to is the Bush Memorial. For those of you who are familiar with Troy, that used to be the First Presbyterian Church. It's that white Greek temple on the corner of First and Congress Streets on the Russell Sage College campus. It has 3 Tiffany windows. I'll show you 2 here. This is a somewhat older one from about 1895 or so. And this one's a newer one from about 1915 or 1916. And notice the contrast. This is sort of a state ecclesiastical scene. It's very creative because it's on the sunny side of the building. So there's bright sun behind this, but it looks like a night scene, and the light is radiating onto the garments from this lamp. That's all done with plating. There's all kinds of extra layers here that make all those colors behind the white translucent glass of the robe. This one, as you can see, has this beautiful pastel colored sky and lots of nature scenes. There are people in it, all right, but it's much more nature oriented than this one is. And that's part of what happened with Tiffany over time, is that it evolved from more traditional ecclesiastical scenes to more nature oriented scenes. Both of these windows, by the way, are signed. Not all Tiffany windows are signed. We don't even know for sure some of the windows whether they're Tiffany or not, because they didn't keep very good records. They didn't sign them all, etc. But these two are signed. This one is signed with an older signature, and this one is signed with a newer signature. There were several different signatures over the years. This was the earliest one, Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company. This one was on the older one, and this one is on the newer one. It looks sort of, it's sort of getting into the roaring 20s almost, and it's more cursive design. This more traditional signature you can find not at the Bush Memorial, but at St. John's Episcopal Church. This window, which is one of my favorites in Troy because of the beautiful coloration of it, is signed with that original Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company signature right down here in little tiny letters. It's also a really great window because it gives you a great example of confetti glass in the halo of the Christ figure here. This particular depiction from the Bible, which is the suffer the little children to come unto me, parable from the Bible, is a very common theme. There are 4 windows that are Tiffany's in Troy that have the suffer the little children to come unto me depicted in them, all slightly different. Sadly, it's usually because the window was paid for by parents of a child who had died in infancy, and the window is memorial to the child. But the most spectacular window, there are again about 6 Tiffany windows at St. John's, as well as a baptismal font that's done by Tiffany. The most spectacular one is over the entrance. It's got 5 lancets. It's called St. John's Vision of the Holy City from the Book of Revelations, and it has 8,000 pieces of glass in it. And it was designed by my favorite Tiffany designer, Agnes Northrup. Agnes grew up in Flushing, which back then was not Flushing Meadows like the Met Stadium and the World's Fairs. It was very bucolic, and there were a lot of nurseries there. And she became very fascinated with plants and gardening. She was an avid gardener. She was an avid painter of flowers, etc. She's really quite a nature lover, and is really the mastermind behind all of Tiffany's landscape windows. She festooned all of her windows with flowers as much as she could. Just to give you one example, this window is not in Troy, but it's a good example. Here she has poppies down below, and she has passion flowers strung all over across the top. I chose this one because one of my dearest people in the world to me is my friend Colleen, and she's an avid nature lover and a gardener, and she loves passion flowers. So this one's for you, Colleen. When that St. John's window went in, it didn't have any people in it. And it was unveiled in 1899 at a time when it was still controversial to do a window in a church that didn't have any humans in it. It wasn't from the Bible. And this is the editorial that the New York Times published in 1899 about that window that you just saw that Agnes Northrup designed. I'm going to read it real quick, even though it's a whole lot of words. I know it's more than you're supposed to have in a single slide, but I'm going to do it anyway. It has generally been supposed that all stained glass windows representing a subject capable of coherent interpretation, at least in the serious domain of religious art, must be filled with human figures. The presentation windows of cathedral chapels contain portraits of people engaged in some religious act towards Christ and the saints. The great choir and clerestory windows, clerestory are the windows way up high in the church, of French cathedrals are filled with all the legendary and miraculous details in the life of saints and martyrs. But, and here's the important part, there have been several attempts in recent years to combine in the effect of stained glass and landscape, pure and simple, unrelieved by the figure. One has just been completed. The subject represents a vision of the New Jerusalem as revealed to St. John. The idea of the landscape, I can't read it because it's behind somebody, the landscape something, art in stained glass work is here seriously put forward. That was a glowing editorial praising that St. John's window here in Troy, New York. And once that appeared, all the other people in all the other churches around the country said, well, maybe we should do a landscape window too. And that really ushered in the era of Tiffany landscape windows, with Agnes Northrup being the primary designer, hiding in the shadows, designing them all for him. And that window, as a result, is one of the most significant Tiffany windows in the world because it changed the course of the design of the whole thing. Now let's move on. Fourth place in downtown Troy, where you can see lots of Tiffany, is the Troy Public Library itself, finished in the mid-1890s. Mrs. Hart decided to have Tiffany come and do all the windows in that building. There's a beautiful reading room on the second floor, those of you who know it. It's very big and open and airy and light. Partly it's because they designed the building to be like a cube instead of rectangular, so that it would be big and open. And they designed it after the palazzos in Venice, in Italy. And the skylight, lay light up above, all the big windows on the side, which are mostly clear, are all Tiffany windows, etc. And then over at the circulation desk is this famous window called the Aldus Window. And we'll return to that in a little bit after we've shown you around town a little bit more. St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church down in South Troy has the most windows, Tiffany windows, of any place in town. It has over 40 Tiffany windows, many of them signed. And a lot of them, rather than being original compositions, are instead copies of famous works of art. I should say first that on either side of the entrance, there are these two cute little round windows with these little cherub heads in them and all these nice blue pastel colors. I love blue. So I really like this. And Agnes Northrup did these. You'll notice these little baby heads with wings on them in the sky. That's one of the gimmicks that she used all the time. I love those. But more importantly, probably around the room, are these great big windows, which are copies of famous works of art. The Assumption of the Virgin Mary window on the east side of the church is a pretty much a copy in glass of Titian's Assumption of the Virgin Mary that you see here on the right. You can see the obvious parallels here and the arm going up here, etc. This is obviously a Titian in glass. Now, they modified it a little bit. They put all of Agnes Northrup's little cherub heads all around it, and they used the pastel blue sky instead of this bright orange, etc. But you get the idea. That's where they borrowed it. You can still go see Titian's Assumption if you go to Venice. Here it is. It's about 12 by 23 feet, and you can go see it there in the church. Next stop is the Gardner Earl Chapel and Crematorium at Oakwood Cemetery. It has, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8. It has about 10 Tiffany windows, including 4 very early ones, which I'm not going to show you on either side here, which depict summer, fall, winter, and spring, and are all flowers. And then there's this 3-panel window behind the altar with the Sea of Galilee running across behind all 3 of the windows. Very beautiful, very bright, and the whole interior is just gorgeous, full of all kinds of things. The mosaics on the floor here were almost certainly designed by Holzer from Tiffany. Let's see. Now, there were other people who made these kinds of windows. I already talked about John Lafarge, and some of his competitors have windows in Troy. That Gardner Earl Chapel and Crematorium has 2 glorious windows. This picture doesn't do nearly justice to the 2 windows, done by Maitland Armstrong and his daughter. Maitland Armstrong did work for Tiffany for a while, and then they broke off in Lower Manhattan and did their own windows. They're known for using very bright jewel glass for one thing or another. And his daughter did very good faces. The faces are very well known in all of their windows. Lafarge has at least one window in a bay window overlooking Fifth Avenue in downtown Troy that I know of. There was a woman who designed these windows. Her name is Mary Tillinghast, and there are a couple of Tillinghast windows that we think are Tillinghasts in Troy. If you want to see a genuine, for sure, Tillinghast, go down to the church at 12th and Broadway in New York City, along with 22 Manili bells up in the top. It has a beautiful Tillinghast window, a great big bold black signature on it saying Mary Tillinghast. It's like nobody's going to pretend this one was done by Tiffany. It was done by me. There was also a fellow in Boston who did Tiffany-like windows, and his name is Edwin Ford, and he has one sort of unusual window at St. Paul's, which tricks all the people who come on the tours because it sort of looks like a Tiffany. And I say, is that a Tiffany? And I'll say, yes. And I say, no, it's not. I might add that Maitland Armstrong, who did this window with his daughter, also did all the windows at the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, in case you ever go to see that. I'd love to spend the next 3 hours showing you every single Tiffany window in Troy, but we don't have that much time, and they're very hard to photograph. I'm not too good at it. A couple people are, but I'm not. So that's pretty much all you get. You'll just have to come to Troy and walk around. If you get a hold of me, I'll try to help you do that. We did, until last year with the pandemic, do a Tiffany tour every September. Maybe that'll happen again. I don't know. But you just have to go around and see it. The people at the Troy Public Library are especially accommodating, and I want to thank them for that. Every time I've ever gone in there with anybody who wants to see their window, they turn off all the lights and they backlight the window, and it's this window that they backlight, so everybody can sit there and gawk at it and disrupt all the library patrons so that we can see the window. They're very generous. To return the favor for them, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this window, because it turns out we have just recently figured out where this window came from and what it's all about. It's called the Aldus Window, and it depicts this fellow right here, whose name was Aldous Minutius, a printer, showing off a book, which is his new version of Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian, to a whole bunch of admirers. And I'll tell you who they are later on. And he's in Venice. You can see here the bell tower of the Campanile for St. Mark's in the middle of downtown Venice, there in the background. What better thing to put in as the dedicated window in a library, which was the idea, since this is one of the most important moments in the history of printing of books. And I'll tell you why as we tell this story. As I do so, I want to give thanks to John Benton, who was my medieval and Renaissance history professor at Caltech way back in the late 60s, who taught me everything I know about Florence and about Venice and so on, and the Quattrocento, which was the 1400s, which he spent a whole term on nothing but Florence in the 1400s. It was a wonderful course. So I owe this to him. Aldus Minutius was born in 1449, a mere 500 years before me. And he was first and foremost, he was born just outside of Rome, a tutor. He got a job teaching Greek and Latin classics to rich people's children. That's essentially what he did. And as he started to do that, he realized very early on that he didn't have any materials to use with his students. No matter how much money they had, they couldn't find materials where they could read the Greek and Latin, the classics in Greek and Latin. So he decided to go into printing on his own to print such books. And he started a thing called the Aldine Press in 1494. And this was, we would now call it the logo, they call it the colophon, which was their logo for their printing press. And you may recognize this because Doubleday, the publisher, now uses a modified version of this same colophon, but they stole it from Aldus Minutius. And Aldus Minutius stole it from the Emperor Tiberius many, many years earlier than that, in 80, we used to call it AD, now Common Era. You notice that exact same design right here on the coins from 80 AD, and they stand for a famous Latin saying, which is my motto, festina lente, which means make haste slowly. The dolphin is making haste and the anchor is keeping it slow. That's the whole idea. And that was his motto. Do things as expeditiously as you can, but don't go too fast or you'll screw it all up. That's basically the idea. Now, Aldus was born 10 years after Johannes Gutenberg first started developing movable type. It took him a few more years after 1439 to really get the movable type and the printing press and everything working right and to do his famous Bible. But it was about 10 years before Aldus that people started doing movable type. Instead of doing manuscript books, you could actually do print books, and you didn't have to do them the old-fashioned way where you take a piece of wood and carve the wood and then print the wood carving. You could actually put little pieces of type all together and then print it that way. And so that came just at the right time for Aldous Minutius to adopt that. Gutenberg was not first a printer. He was first the son of a metal worker and a goldsmith who was involved with the mint in Mainz, where he lived, where he grew up. And he got the idea from working with all those metalworking things that you could use that to cast little letters and produce things in type. Books that are printed with movable type before 1501, which is when Aldus Minutius changes the world by the way he does it, are called incunabulo. They're great collector's items among bookhounds. Here's one, and it's the first one that not only had movable type printing, but it also had illustrations tacked onto the top of it with a little woodcut. So you can see by 1461, you're starting to see some creative work around printing, and that's right the context where Aldus starts doing his stuff. And one of the reasons why Aldus was important is because all the people who were starting to use movable type had to, of course, have these great big type cases with all these little letters in them for every single letter of the alphabet. And if you had 24 T's on a single page, you had 24 little T's in the little T box here, etc. And that got particularly difficult for printers who were trying to use this new method of printing when you printed Greek. Because if you're going to do Greek right, you have to have all of these little accents over the top of it. This is, for thus loved God the world, as he sent his only begotten son, etc. And you see all these funny little accents all over it. So not only do you have to have the whole Greek alphabet without the accents, you then have to have all the letters with the accents. And nobody was printing in movable type in Greek until Aldus. And Aldus, starting in 1495, was the first person to print Aristotle in Greek with movable type. And here's a page from one of his books. But the curious thing about it was that he originally printed it in the kind of book sizes that everybody was printing in, called the folio format. This is the only folio book I've got in my library. It's the last Whole Earth catalog from 1971. You see how big it is. He quickly realized that if he was going to be printing these books for his kids, the rich people's children, so he could teach them Aristotle, they had to lug these big fat folio books around with them to be able to use them. And he realized very quickly that that wasn't a very smart format. So what does he come up with? Well, first of all, he starts inventing lots of other type fonts so that you can discriminate with what he does. This is the very first page ever printed using the italic font. And it was used for the word Jesu, of course, Jesus, or Jesus Christ, on this one illustration. By the way, you notice it was carved by a fellow. He carved all those letters. He was the guy who did the first italic letters, and he was later executed because he beat his brother-in-law to death with a pipe, with a piece of pipe. So, as if there were no colorful episodes in history back then. Anyway, what Aldus figured out was that you didn't have to, here's the folio format that you just saw in the last Whole Earth catalog. You didn't have to print anything that big. You could shrink it way down to what's called the Octavo format right here. And it's called the Octavo format. I'll just show you the last book I bought at Market Block Books last week, which is a book about a fugitive slave who lived out the rest of his life in my hometown of Princeton, New Jersey. If my brother's watching, it's his hometown too. And it's called the Octavo Format because what you did was you took that big sheet of paper for the folio format and you printed 8 pages on one side and 8 pages on the other side. So you have what's called a 16-page signature, and you fold it up 3 times, once here and once there and then once there. And you have this 16-page thing. And if you put all the pages in upside down and backwards just right, it comes out correct. And then you can cut it up and you make what he called a pocketbook. And the kids could put them in their pockets. That was the whole idea. It was wildly popular. He was the first person in the world to do that. And the first book he published in the Octavo format was the works of Virgil, the poet from Naples in Italy. And here's one of those, a copy of one of those books. Virgil, of course, the poet, is especially important to Troy because Virgil, here he is, by the way, he's best known for his famous line, Omnia vincit amor, which love conquers all. Here he is, and yes, there are 2 spellings. Some people spell it with an I and some with an E, but mostly today people spell it with an I. He's especially important to Troy because he also published a book, a poem called, long poem, epic poem called the Aeneid in 24 BCE or thereabouts, and with the famous line in it, Ilium fuit Troia est. Ilium means the city. The city of Troy, you all know, went down in flames. This fellow Aeneas lived there, moved from there to Rome, and helped infuse the spirit of the great city of Troy into Rome. So that way, Troy still lives on in Rome. And so when the people on the waterfront in Troy, here on the Hudson, wanted to come up with a name for their city, they called it Troy because they wanted Aeneas to come here and infuse the spirit of the great city of Troy into the place along the Hudson River. So here was the first octavo version of the Divine Comedy, the book that we saw in that stained glass window, which he published a year later, 1502. It was his 7th octavo book, and it's the first one that's not in Greek and not in Latin. It's in Italian. So it was a bestseller. People loved it. It was very important. And guess where we found out the design for the window came from? There's a club in New York City, just east of Central Park, called the Grolier Club. It's named after this guy right here, Jean Grolier. Grolier was from Lyon, France. He lived from about 1489 to 1565. He ended up being the Treasurer General of France. He was a great diplomat and statesman, and he hung out in Venice a lot. And he was a good friend of Aldus Minutius. And he was arguably by everybody the first collector of printed books using movable type. And this is a painting by a man named Francois Flaming, a French painter who painted, this is almost life-size, these people are huge, for the Grolier Book Club to put on the wall in their entrance in 1894. Well, it turns out the Grolier Book Club a few years ago did a wonderful show in their club with over 100 books published by Aldous Minutius in the Aldine Press in Venice around 1500. Here's a little catalog of the thing. When I found out about it, I just had to go down to see those books. And I walk into the Grolier Club, and there on the wall is this painting. And I took one look at it and I said, that's the Aldus Window from Troy Public Library. And sure enough, when it was unveiled in 1894, guess who was a member of the Grolier Club and attended the unveiling? Louis Comfort Tiffany had become a member 10 years earlier, and he lived 12 blocks away, and he was there for the unveiling of that painting. So when Mary Hart in Troy gets a hold of him, or has her agent get a hold of him and say, we want you to do windows for a new library in Troy, he says, madam, I have just the book-oriented window for you. And he gets Frederick Wilson, this fellow right here, who is the angel wing guy, among other things. He and Sperry and Holzer and Northrup were the 4 top window designers for Tiffany. He gets Frederick Wilson to take that painting that you just saw and copy it and come up with a window based on the design, they have the design polished up this much by the end of 1895 before they start making the window. And the New York Times runs a picture of it saying, this great new window is going to be produced by Tiffany. And sure enough, it was, and it's here in Troy. And here's how it evolved. From that flaming window here, over to Wilson's study of it, then fully fleshed out as the window at the Troy Public Library, making it one of the most unusual and original windows, and of course, appropriate windows for a library. And now you know how they did it, and you know where you should start. When you come to Troy and look at all their windows, you should go see the Aldus window behind the circulation desk at the Troy Public Library. You're now Tiffany window experts. Go around and look at windows in churches and go up to them real close and rub your hands over the drapery glass, and you'll know for sure you're looking at a Tiffany window. How's that?
That's great, Tom. Thank you so much. It's
You're
always so
welcome.
interesting. No matter how many times I hear it, I always learn something new.
A couple of new details this time.
That's right. If anybody has any questions, you can put it in the chat and we'll have Tom
How do I find the chat?
answer any of them.
Let's see, should I stop sharing?
Yeah, that probably makes it easier. There you go.
Hi, Pepper. Who else is here do I know? Well, let's see, Jerry's there. Hi, Jerry.
I don't see any questions, Tom. It's mostly just great information, fantastic talk, that kind of
Let's see, great information. That's in my high school buddy, Annie
enlightening.
Hall.
Oh, there's a play on words, enlightening, because it's
Enlightening.
window, right?
Oh. that's
Like
my
that?
brother.
Oh, here we go. Did the artists etch their names into the glass?
No, they didn't etch their names. Most of the time, the designers didn't put their names on it. They put Tiffany's company name onto it if they signed it with anything, but they never etched it into glass. They would paint on a black substance that they could then anneal onto the glass. It's usually very, very fragile. If you just touch it, it peels right off. So if you ever go to a Tiffany window, rub your hands all over the drapery glass all you want, but don't touch the hands or the faces or the feet or any signature that you find, because they're very fragile. Occasionally, Tiffany would let others put their names on the glass. Holzer signed his murals in the baptismal fonts, both at St. Paul's and at St. John's. He signed the window over the altar at St. Paul's, and he signed the other window. He took Agnes Northrup with him to a big exhibition in Paris in the 1890s, and Agnes had done a really beautiful landscape floral window there. And he let her sign it and be given the attribution as the window designer, and it won a big prize at the exhibition. So she was known some. Driscoll was known to some people, but she was the lamp person more than the window person. She didn't really design the windows. There were others, but it was mostly that crew: Holzer, Sperry, Northrup, and I've forgotten the last one.
There's another. Where is the window on Fifth Avenue?
Oh, the window on Fifth Avenue is on the second. That's the Lafarge. It's on the second floor, and it's what everybody calls a bay window. It's actually, if you're an architect, you know the difference. It's an oriel window, as it's called. But for most people, it's a bay window sticking out on the second floor, about midway down the block between Broadway and Fulton. And it's on the west side of the street. I don't know the house number.
And somebody's just asking, we did record it, so
It's
yes.
very dark blue. Oh, there's a lot of things coming in now.
Yes. Has anyone estimated the value of the Troy glass windows?
All of them together? I've never tried to sum them up. I do know what the appraised value was of the Agnes Northrup 5 lancet window at St. John's, because they removed the whole thing and sent it to North Adams, Massachusetts, to Cummings Stained Glass Studios. And a wonderful woman there who I owe a lot to because she taught me a lot, Diane Rousseau, completely disassembled and rebuilt that whole window, completely restored it. And they had to get an appraised value before they did that. But I'm not at liberty to tell you what it is because it's sort of embarrassingly high. I could tell you that if you wanted to buy a Tiffany window about 1895, a 3x5 window then would go for about $700, which today would be, you know, 10,000 or something. It'd be worth a lot more than that now. A major Tiffany window, full size, can easily go for $10 or $15 million if it's a really good one. Some of them have been lost. Some of them have been stolen. There was a very famous case. A fellow named Alistair Duncan published several books on Tiffany windows, some of the best, and was then arrested in a sting operation, supposedly for fencing Tiffany windows from mausoleums in New York City cemeteries to Japanese buyers. He to this day claims he was framed and he's innocent, but he did time as a felony offense for stealing Tiffany windows. So they are pretty valuable. They've gone up way in value lately. It's like the lamps. You could have bought a Tiffany lamp in good condition at a garage sale about 1950 for $100, and now they're going for $275,000 if they're really good ones.
That's crazy.
The windows are the same.
Here's one. Are you aware of any archival materials related to any of these commissions, correspondence with any of the churches, bills of sale, anything like that?
Yes, the quality of the archival backup for all of this varies. At the Troy Public Library, they still have the receipt for that Aldus window. It cost $1,200, I think it was. I've got a photocopy of it here in my folder. St. Paul's has quite a bit on theirs. What Tiffany did for their client was, after they got contacted and told that they wanted them to do a window, that they would come and look at the site and measure it and discuss it with the client and get a feeling for what themes would be appropriate, what they had in mind. Also try to figure out how much money they had to know how fancy a window they could make. And then they do some preliminary drawings, and they end up doing either a watercolor or a little oil painting with a miniature of the window in it. And they would give that to the client once they'd all agreed on what the window was going to look like. And St. Paul still has that mock-up for one of their windows, for example. But other places, we just don't know. We don't know. I don't think St. Joe's knows who paid for those 40 windows in South Troy. But somebody did. It was a single donor, and I think they kept it a secret. Without question, the parents of Gardner Earl paid for everything for the Gardner Earl Chapel and Crematorium at Oakwood Cemetery. Gardner Earl was their only child, and he died very young and was a big advocate of cremation. And there was no place around here that could cremate anybody. So they had to send his body to Buffalo to be cremated. So as a memorial to him, they built that crematorium so people could be cremated here. And they spent such a fortune on it. It's a glorious building. The interior is the most sumptuous interior of anything I know in the Capital Region. They threw away all the plans and the paperwork because they didn't want anybody to know how much it was worth. We don't have any records of that at all.
It says, besides windows and lamps, was Tiffany's glass used for anything else, whether decorative or useful?
Oh my, yes. I mean, Tiffany, especially after they started the furnace in Corona, Queens, and Arthur Nash started really going to town creating other kinds of glass. They did all kinds of things, vases and desk sets and so on and so forth, and jewelry. And they came up with a kind of glass that's called Favrile glass, F-A-V-R-I-L-E, a trademark name that they came up with. And I'm sure you've seen it. If you look at a Favrile glass vase from Tiffany, the outside looks sort of shimmery and metallic. It has sort of rainbow metallic colors on it. Looks like if you drop a drop of oil in a puddle and it spreads out and produces all those rainbow colors. It's sort of like that. They produced all manner of Tiffany things of that sort. They produced pulpits for churches. They did mosaics. There's huge mosaics in Philadelphia and in Chicago done by Tiffany. Holzer did the mosaic all across the back wall of the stage of Alexander Hall in Princeton, where I grew up. One of the most spectacular Tiffany mosaics anywhere in the world. You know, I don't think they ever did any clothes, maybe, but they certainly did desk sets and jewelry and vases and various and sundry other glass objects. If you just Google Tiffany glass in Google Images, you can look at Tiffany glass till the cows come home.
All right, and here's our last question. Any other venue remotely comparable to Troy for this art form?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you don't want to necessarily see it in its natural habitat, as they say, go down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Fifth Avenue in New York City. They had tons of Tiffany there. Alice Frelinghuysen is their curator for Tiffany stuff, and they've got some of the best Tiffany things around. There's also in Queens the Neustadt collection. Neustadt was a collector and collected all kinds of Tiffany lamps. They've got a huge collection of Tiffany lamps in Queens. There is down in Florida, in Winter Haven, Florida, a museum that has also a ton of Tiffany stuff, much of it taken from Laurelton Hall, which was Tiffany's mansion on Long Island. After his father died in the early 1900s, he inherited a ton of money and he built this great big mansion in Cold Spring, New York. And the idea was he was going to make it into an artist colony and have artists in residence come and apprentice there, etc. And unfortunately, A, he died, B, the Depression set in, and then it burned to the ground in the early 1950s. So a bunch of his followers went after it and rescued what they could from the rubble. And that was sort of the core of this new collection in Winter Haven, Florida. It's on my bucket list, but I've never been there. There are lots of places, you know, churches all over that have Tiffany windows in them. If anybody wants, you can just send me an email and I'll tell you where they are in your neighborhood. It's just tom@pthomascarroll.com. Philip is my real first name, which I don't use, so it's PTHOMASCARROLL.com. If you send me an email or get a hold of the library, they'll forward it to me, and I'll look it up in my Tiffany books and tell you what Tiffany windows are around your hometown.
Thank you so much again, Tom. This was great.
My pleasure.
Lots of great comments, as always.
Thank you so much.
And we'll tell everybody that you will be back with us on June 9th.
June 9th.
At the same time at 6:30 to talk about Charles Darwin. So
yeah, I was the first assistant editor of the Charles Darwin Correspondence Project in an earlier life, and I'll talk about that night. Same time, same station.
And Tom, can you just give me your email? I'm going to type it into somebody wants it in the chat so they can.
Oh, sure. Tom, T-O-M.
Yep.
At pthomascarroll.com.
P. Thomas Carroll.
Yeah, you know that, right?
I do. I just don't have it right in front of me.
I'll watch it.
Does that look right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Right amount of R's and L's.
Yes, 2 R's, 2 L's.
Yep.
When in doubt, do it twice.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll see you for Darwin.
Thank you. Can
Thanks
we not log off yet? I want to read everything in the chat. Is that allowed?
Okay. It is allowed. I don't know if I can. I wonder if I can save it. I've never tried to save
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Try and save it, Tom. I don't know. You can read. Do you want to read? Do you want to take a minute and read stuff, or?
Yeah, I'll go real quick.
Okay. I don't want to shut you out.
Great information. Hi, Annie. Enlightening. Very funny, Pepper. Enlightening.
I like that. I thought that was pretty.
Oh, I'll show you. Is Chrissy still on? No. I'll show Chrissy the artist names later. Let's see. Where's the window? Jerry, if you want to know about the Lafarge window, get a hold of me, and if Jerry's still there, I'll show it to you. Let's see. Yeah, okay, good. Yes, that's right. The Art Center offers classes. Good. Great. New stack collection, good. Gene Cheviak, I didn't know Gene was here. Gene's still there? I didn't catch that. Hello, Gene, long time no see. And hello to Meg if she's still here. Miss you, Meg. My favorite editor in the whole world, Meg Gallion.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, thanks again, Tom.
My pleasure.
See you in a little bit.
All for you, Carolyn.
Yeah, okay. Thanks
Bye,
again.
bro.
Bye.